elder people in the house. And, so a more equitable environment is an opportunity that has been given to us, unfortunately, through the pandemic of COVID. So I'm just going to ask you to also reflect some of those gender roles that we've been playing during the last 1.5 months, to see how they are changeable, they are very dynamic, and they are not natural or given, should we decide to also move and transgress to what the society has been preaching us otherwise. So what do we actually then mean with gender equality? And before we actually reach to gender equality, the concept of substantive equality comes in, which is to recognize that women are still in an unequal position. They are treated very differently from men, and therefore there have to be equal opportunities for more equal results. For an example, what substantive equality would mean is that if not all of the fingers in our hand are equal, they are sized very differently, different opportunities will apply to each of the individual finger in our hand till they become an equal size, and then we move on to talk about equality. But till we reach that stage of equality, one size does not fit all, and therefore the concept of substantive equality needs to be applied in our everyday work, both in our personal work and professional work, to see how equal opportunities can gain us equal results for men and women and those who identify themselves with different gender identities. Here is another example in addition to what I've just talked about in terms of the fingers in our hand, which is what does it take for us to achieve gender equality? Understanding how one particular situation, and right now for us is the situation of COVID-19 pandemic, how is that differently and disproportionately affecting different gender identities? And therefore, we need to think, what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the initiatives which we need to take in order to create that kind of equal benefit and result for everyone. This is my favorite slide. I think this is something that we would aspire to, achieve, which is on one hand, how we are changing our socialized or normal gender roles to see how can women also step out. And of course, we've been reading in the news how women have been at the forefront for COVID response. About 46 to 47% of all of our healthcare workers, which does include ASHA workers, which includes midwives, which includes community volunteers who are responding to health emergencies, are actually women. So, the first slide then says, how can we transgress those very normalized social norms and gender roles to create equal opportunities for both men and women? And the second one is a society which we would want ideally to live in. I would just take a moment here for you to please respond to the first poll question. And Abhay, if you can please guide everybody to take the poll question here. Hi, sorry, Abhay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes.
No, as I said, the poll will be on right now, and the participants have 45 seconds to answer. Here goes. Okay, do we presume that we stop here? So that's
Sure.
the result for you, Sania.
Thank you. I think we can discuss the poll question towards the end, which will also give everyone the opportunity to reflect a bit more on this question, which is, do you think gender stereotypes are supported through our media reporting? Whatever form of media reporting we may be engaging in, either digital media or print media or even television. So moving on, why do we need gender inclusive society? It is to establish equality, to address both women and men's needs, to stop violence against women and girls, to empower women and girls, because as Abhay had also touched in the introduction, there are existing inequalities. To have a safe working space and homes for everyone, to ensure inclusive governance processes, and to ensure inclusive development as we move towards solidifying our response to the pandemic of COVID-19. Just in terms of also what is gender-based violence in humanitarian setting which we are facing right now, and one would have read numerous articles not just from India but globally on how domestic violence and intimate partner violence has been on an increase and is actually touching the roof because of this forced coexistence in the houses, because one does also understand there is limited access for women to seek support despite several initiatives by the government, by our civil society actors, by our community volunteers, etc., etc. So, what is gender based violence? I think for us, the framework lies in also the normative frameworks. CEDAW being one of that, which is legally binding for India, as India is signatory to Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which was adopted in 1980 as it was introduced in 1979. It says gender based violence is a form of discrimination that seriously inhibits women's ability to enjoy rights and freedoms on the basis of equality with men. It does broaden from an initial focus of violence against women to become an umbrella term for violence that is perpetrated based on socially ascribed gender differences. Any act of gender based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, excluding threats of such, including threats of such acts, coercion, deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life, is violence against women. Our national laws are very, very strong on acts of violence, and has a very, very comprehensive definition in our legislation on what is included as violence against women and girls, which also includes stalking, for example, which also includes voyeurism, which also includes using foul language or show off any sort of sexual image or video to your female counterparts, either at workplace or in public spaces or at home. We do understand that the root causes of this kind of sexual and gender-based violence does lie in a lot of socialization, a lot of stereotyping, which means men can do this, women can do this, or they can't do this or that. Perception of our masculinity in the patriarchal society that we live in, a lot of our social and cultural norms that encourage harmful practices, for example, child marriage, which we also understand from our media reports is actually on a rise due to the pandemic of COVID-19. and also our individual behavior, how we perceive certain things to be gendered, how we perceive individually things that men can do and women cannot do, etc. Now, like I'd also touched, the forms of violence does include sexual violence, physical violence, emotional or psychological violence. But as we also see, there is economic and structural violence at play, especially visible in the time of COVID-19. One can see economic loss and violence discrimination that perpetrates in a situation like this, where a woman may not be able to equally achieve economic benefits. For example, if we were to analyze the financial stimulus package that the government has announced in the month of March, do we see how much of that is actually gender responsive in nature? While we do talk about women getting benefits through Jandhan, for example, are there also equal opportunities for women to participate in Narega? I know that the government has opened up opportunities under the Narega program for all of those migrant workers to start, their economic life cycle again. It's very interesting for us to understand how many women are actually getting those work opportunities under Narega, and are there any special provisions for them? Because what we fail to recognize sometimes is also that there are a lot of women that are heads of a household, so female headed households that have to prioritize economic opportunities for income generation. There are a lot of single women, a lot of widows who do not otherwise have a family support for any kind of income generation, and so on. So some of these things which we'll also have to reflect from a very gendered perspective. Just very quickly, some of the sites of violence that I've also been talking about, which is public spaces and community places, which is our private spaces and workspaces, but also increasingly now on digital and online spaces. Where now we are forced into moving our entire life and setup online through virtual work systems. There is a lot of violence that also gets perpetrated digitally and in online spaces. I will just place an example here for our understanding, which is the very recent, since yesterday we've been hearing about the boys' locker room episode, which comes at one of the social media platforms. So how some of the rape culture and how the gender and sexual violence is being perpetrated online, targeted to a particular gender. I will skip a lot of this, but for our brief understanding, there are multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. While there may be a discrimination economically, it could also be perpetuated because of their caste identity, religious identity, their ethnicity, etc. So there can be, and there are multiple layers to a violence that perpetrates against a particular gender identity. Of course, there's displacement, destruction, economic stress, environment of fear that also heightens the risk of violence against women and girls. We've talked about increase of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, also now trafficking, because that increases when there is a crisis situation, and the culture of silence, because most of the time there is so much of fear and shame attached to any kind of sexual violence against women that they also refrain from reporting this kind of an episode or an incident. So just in terms of that, social distancing and stay at home preventive practices, which does bring us to increased risk of domestic violence, increased burden on women and girls for unpaid and care work, a lot of intergenerational transference of violence, because as we display emotions of violence and discrimination, we also relay that for our coming generation to adopt. Interim shock to traditional role of men in the family, which also then perpetuates discrimination and violence. Loss of livelihood, distress migration for both men and women. We have to think about that to see how that makes women and girls more vulnerable to sexual violence or to trafficking, for example. And let me take another example here is that when we've been hearing about distressed migration and how the migrant population was stuck in different cities, did we also reflect on how the women and girls who are probably at the detention camps or at other shelter homes being exploited or being exposed to any kind of sexual violence, so to say? Or let's say that when we are distributing food packages at these shelter homes and these detention camps, are women able to reach to that point to have access to those food packages? Or is it only a line or a group of men in the forefront, which sort of deters the woman to even enter that line for the fear of any kind of violence she may face? Increased burden of government systems and structures. Of course, we've been seeing that our health systems have been ably working to respond to the situation of pandemic, but they are also very, very overwhelmed. So then how do we see women as a large part of health workers, for example, being at risk, and what do we try to do to prevent that kind of risk? We've been hearing disturbing stories of discrimination against both male and female health workers who've been doing their rounds in the community, checking people on their status of health, but the kind of discrimination that women are facing in doing their periodic rounds in the community. So these are some of the things that I wanted to highlight here for us to think on. Just for us to also sort of, graphically see how women have been at the forefront, but to reflect some of the critical questions that are coming up to us. While schools are closed, how do women juggle in earning and caring, especially for those who are single parents? So if I have to work but I also have to take care of my child at home, how do I juggle? And is that something that I need to bring out in media up for discussion? Or to say she anyway gets paid less than me, so she can sit at home, which is usually the narrative, because the gender pay gap is so vast in the country, and not just India, it is globally a fact that men do get paid more than women in similar job positions and context. It's easier for then men to say that I get paid more, so you can afford to lose your job and sit at home while I'll go out and earn for us. So these are just some of the narratives that I wanted to pose in front of us, while we now delve into what can some of the gender responsive media actions can be. Just before that, I did take the opportunity from our previous media reports also, what have we been seeing so far is a little bit of, how the textile industry or how some of the informal home-based workers are working. But have we been talking about women as such? Or have we been talking about women who are either entrepreneurs or have a startup? Have we been talking about women within the migrant community or women as health workers? And to complicate that, some of these different identities that we need to unlayer unpack when we are talking about any sort of media reporting, when we are talking about media questions that we need to ask ourselves and the society, especially in this COVID pandemic. How is language impacting women? How is their class impacting economic opportunities for women? How is education impacting violence against women and girls, etc., etc.? So these are some layers through which we can actually identify multiple vulnerabilities of both men and women to see how a particular crisis situation impacts them differently and disproportionately. So I'm going to skip all of this, but come directly to mainstreaming gender in media. But while we do that, some quick facts for us on the screen. Just to also say that although women constitute more than half of the world's population, their voices to a large extent are not viewed as newsworthy. And I've displayed different stats, different graphs for us to show how women's voices are or are not center stage when we're talking about popular media forums and the discussions around a particular situation. So just an example here in the graphs, if you can see, magazines have about 35% of women as leaders who also write popular columns. Newspapers have probably only 2% of women in senior leadership position. Digital portals of all has the maximum, which is a little more than a quarter of share, where women show leadership in any sort of news reporting. And the other stats are in front of you to see. Now, looking at this, the lack of women's voices or visibility in mainstream media opposes our basic agenda of sustainable development, which is the Agenda 2030, as we are familiar with, and the principle of leave no one behind, which is all of the identities that I had highlighted here. The underrepresentation or misrepresentation of women can significantly skew the way women and girls view themselves. And that is a responsibility on us as media reporters, as media trainers, as media students and professors. This can lead them to undermine their importance in a predominantly male-driven society and can also shape the attitudes and beliefs, either reinforcing gender stereotypes or excluding women from very important matters. And I just wanted to quickly show a 1-minute video here for us to understand that.
Through the millennia, culture has been shaped by the stories we tell. And if you think about it, advertising is telling stories that are backed by billions of dollars to have them heard.
As advertisers, we have the power to shape what society sees as normal or aspirational or acceptable.
When we tell stories involving all the full spectrum of people that we see in the world, we actually make our brands seem more vibrant, more culturally connected, and just more interesting.
I was always different, the rebel.
And I'm convinced that we can normalize gender equality with what we choose to show in our ads and who we choose to make them. And this is so important because what you see shapes who you believe you can be. I passionately believe equality releases both potential and opportunity in people, and therefore can make a massive difference to their lives.
So the video is available on YouTube for us to see, but I will stop here. I think the point that I wanted to make on balancing gender in our reporting, either through advertising or media reports or other mediums that we use, is very, very critical, because we take the responsibility of shaping the popular opinion. So role of media, as I was just touching on, is, it cannot be underestimated. Media can serve as an educator and information provider. It can promote social development and be the primary agent of new socialization, focusing on issues that actually matter. So for us, while we can guide the popular opinion, we can also set the agendas which are more relevant in these newer times, which are more responsive to our different needs as men, women, or other gender identities, which can also lead to or spiral change that one does deserve in the society. So these are some of the questions. Are the media, who's the champion of democracy, human rights, people's participation, inclusive or exclusive of their representation of society? So are we actually seeing our society as a whole, or are we focusing only on particular sections of society, is a question for us to ask. Does the editorial content portray men and women differently or equally, and why or how? These are some of the questions that we as media persons, as the community of media, need to reflect on continuously. These are just some of the examples on blatant stereotyping or subtle stereotyping that are very, very normal in different mediums. Articles or images which portray women in stereotypical roles such as victims or sex objects. Again, also bringing your attention back to the boys' locker room episode that happened, to see how blatant stereotyping works on different social media platforms. Or let's say articles or images that reinforces notions of women's domestic and men's more public role in a way that seems very, very normal. So just to substantiate that, are we also talking about, and these are some of the media headlines that I'd taken out for this purpose. Kerala minister says farming can prevent rape. And is that first a headline that is necessary? Second, is that something that was portrayed correctly? Because if you read this media article that was published, the agenda of the minister was not exactly to say that farming can prevent rape, but it was to say that women's economic rights and their economic empowerment can give them that kind of a negotiation or that bargaining power to prevent sexual violence that they may face at home or at work. Or the second example for, a monster, Singapore man forced wife into prostitution, sexually abused daughter. But do we think that we as the media community need to portray somebody as a monster in the first case, and also perpetuate some disturbing images, which also takes away the emphasis on the important issue that there is here, which is domestic and intimate partner violence, which is abuse of a daughter by the father, and the crux of what one's individual and social understanding in terms of our gender identities and gender dynamics could be that led to this situation in the first place. Or let's say women gang raped in Orissa on suspicion of having illicit affair. And time and again, we've been debating that is illicit affair or is an affair with somebody else really the reason for a gang rape or any kind of furthered discrimination or violence? Is that necessary to bring out? Or should we rather focus on what exactly the situation is? What is the problem? What is the root cause? And what do we plan to address this situation on? Nagaland woman raped at Deer Park. But the question here is, do we really need to bring out her identity as a Northeast person? Or here the question of her being vulnerable to a rape-like situation, again going back to identifying the problem and the solution for it, rather than further reinforcing the stereotypes that usually a person from Northeast origin faces. And I just wanted to highlight this one because, especially in the COVID-19 situation, we did hear some of the examples and instances where in Delhi, there were eggs and stones thrown on women who were from Northeast, and they were called a coronavirus, as a form of violence and discrimination against a particular ethnicity. So the question for us is, are we further stereotyping and normalizing what is wrong, or are we actually identifying the problem and providing solutions for it? So for us, again, going back, some of the examples of what we can actually focus on, and I would love to read more insights on, is women migrant workers and their issues of food and income security. Have we in the recent past come across any good articles, any good op-eds around these issues, or implications of financial relief packages on women farmer producer organizations? How are they looking at direct and indirect taxes, for example? Or women's traditional and climate resilient agricultural practices that one has been following for years now can be a nutrition security solution for us to upscale nationally. Or let's say women in security sector are at the front line of fighting COVID-19, but are they being highlighted? So it could have BSF, it could have CRPF, who is on ground right now fighting and who does have a lot of women in their security sector, but are they being highlighted here? How are they responding to different gendered impact of violence, of COVID? Could be some of the things for us to reflect and write on. Another very interesting thing that I wanted to highlight here was, this is a screenshot of one of the debates on TV channel that I was listening to. And all I could see and then repeatedly started noticing was that all the panel discussions in almost all of the media channels only invites men, or probably of the 7 men in the room, there is 1 woman. Are we actually trying to integrate and center stage the voices of women in this crisis situation? Or is it only going to be a manual to inform what can be done for everybody, which includes men and boys, women and girls, and other gender identities? So are we inclusive in our debates also to make opportunity for women to come and inform on some of our programs, policies, and schemes in the crisis situation? So then, the media can challenge stereotypes in different ways. And here are some of the examples that I find very useful. And I've also led to some of the checklists that I'm happy to share with you, that we often use in our communications when we are devising any media strategy. But some of these are the very basics that we can at least keep in mind: portraying women in their non-traditional roles, such as leadership positions, seeking more sources from the perspective of women and not just men, selecting stories that are often absent from the news agenda, which I've given an example here. Or to also say, writing op-ed and analysis to highlight women's issues and concerns because they've been absent from our popular media. So here is a checklist. I've just divided that in 5 different parts. One is who speaks, how is the story told, what is the language of our communication, visual representation of women in media, and who tells the story. Are women's views and voices heard? So literally who speaks in our media forums? Are male and female subjects treated equally? If women are hard to reach to speak on a story, or they are not an equal or main part of the story, does the coverage raise critical questions as to why women were not a part of this? If some women are difficult to reach, has there been sufficient effort or investigation to understand why? How is the story told? Does the story challenge or reinforce our stereotypes? Are these stereotypes blatant or subtle? The story apportion on blame. Are all subjects treated with dignity? Are the experiences and concerns of women belittled, etc., that I've also touched in the previous slides? The language, does the language avoid any stigmatization and discrimination? Is it relevant gender disaggregated data? Is the relevant just disaggregated data provided? Is physical description relevant to the story? Does the language use or apply equally to men and women? Visual representation, I'm sure that we would be very familiar with all of these. Do the images emphasize or exaggerate on physical or sexual aspects? Are women and men equally represented in an image that is used? Does the image degrade the dignity of women, which by the Constitution of India is also an offense? And then who tells the story? Going back to some of the statistics that I'd mentioned, are female journalists the one who are keen on reporting gender issues and issues of women in our newsrooms or in the magazines? And if yes, why is that the case? Are gender awareness and gender sensitivities built into our reporting requirements? Are sub-editors sensitized to gender as regards to editorial issues and so on? And I'm just going back to the images because if you would see why I would love some of these images, is because there is an equal representation of both men and women in their interchangeable gender roles, interchangeable gender identities, in a much more inclusive and sustainable city setup and environment. So I'm going to leave it here. And just for us, quick yes and no. I'm not going to read through all of this, but really what is a no is, are we focusing exclusively on women? No. Like I said, gender is men and women and other gender identities. So focusing on differences, inequalities amongst men and women. If you decide to work on women because of the discrimination they face, initiatives should be based on the analysis of gender roles and relationships. Identifying existing roles and responsibilities for women and men is a strict no, because one is to encourage participation based on their ability, interest, rather than existing socially determined gender roles. And the rest is for you to read up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sania. What a wonderful presentation. As usual, you're always full of information and new thoughts for all of us. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, sir.
And I think, given your knowledge, your experience, and your amazing communication skills, 45 minutes is a bit too less for you. I wish we had a whole day with you. You've given me a lot of insights. I've heard you earlier also. And I'm sure all our teachers are going to take home lots of learning. And this, I think, will be a good opportunity for them to create very good journalists. I wish your presentation is also seen by present day journalists on how to handle such situations. A lot of issues which have been neglected or overlooked have been brought to light by you. Thank you so much. Tanya, before we take some questions, would you like to take the second poll now?
Yes, yes. And I'm sorry, I think in the flow of the presentation,
No, that's fine. I didn't want to interrupt you on that. Neither did Bhakti. Bhakti, could you take the poll now, please? Thank you. So participants, 45 seconds. So there we have the results.
right.
Sanya, shall we take questions now?
Yes, yes, please.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box, one on YouTube, and two persons have raised their hands.
Sure.
Only one is left now, Dr. Olav Albukar, who was the first one to raise hands. Are you there online, Olav? We'll unmute you. Nice to see you, Olav, once again after a very long time. He's a fellow journalist. He was with the Times of India. Is Olav online? You've been unmuted, Olav. Could you speak? I guess we can't get him. Could we move on to the next hand raised? Dr. Nidhi Thanawala. Okay, Olav, are you there? So we'll go to Nidhi Thanawala.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
So my question is about the gender issues which were presented so well. So thank you so much for the wonderful session where it said that how women are portrayed. What about a lot of jokes that always center around married men, like wife asks for money and how women are portrayed there?
Right. I think that, sorry, can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can, ma'am.
I think that that has also been very, very disturbing, especially in the recent past, as we've been, increasingly becoming at the center of COVID-19. Because, and some of the jokes around men or some of the videos where they've been asked by their wives to do household work, and some of those very comic responses that are shown in the videos or in WhatsApp text messages, etc.
Yes.
What we fail to realize is that it is equal responsibility which was not traditionally being shared equally. But we should be very, very careful in our messaging and communication to say that now is not the time or the opportunity for men to start learning household work, but it was their responsibility in the first place. Now is the time for them to understand those responsibilities and work towards it. So there is one thing to say ki, now we will have to start helping our wives because we are sitting at home. No, because it was always their responsibility that was being neglected because of our socialization. Now is the opportunity to realize that it is our responsibility and to share the unpaid work and the care work. Does that answer your question?
Practical.
We move on to the next question. I'll go to the questions in the chat box. One question is, what is the situation of role of third gender? This has come on the YouTube.
Right. So the situation of third gender, is it?
Yes.
So we've actually been working a lot with our civil society partners, and we also focus a lot and we work a lot on women and men who identify themselves with different gender identities. You know, what we've been hearing repeatedly from those groups is that, the first response is very, very claustrophobic, because now that they are being forced to stay with their families who may not have accepted their different gender identity, they are being increasingly they're facing, this kind of pressure from their parents and their families to subscribe to socially accepted gender binaries. So if I am born as a female, but I feel like a male, I am in the situation of isolation and lockdown, being forced by my family to behave the way my body and my physical appearance is, which is very, very claustrophobic. And if I can also mention, one is getting increased number of calls from the LGBTQI community, for mental health support, for discrimination and violence support within the family. And there are a lot of organizations on ground who are helping and providing psychosocial support to any of the individuals who've been experiencing this kind of pressure from the family.
Could we take a couple of more questions because we are nearing closing time, 5 o'clock. So if you and
Sure.
Lisa, whatever you say, Sania.
Sure, sir. I'm happy to take up more questions.
There's a question on, it's in the chat box. There is some incident. This is from Pritika Khedwal. She says, a question for madam about girls' locker room, also an incident that has come up now. How can this trend be stopped? How can students be guided towards the participation in such toxic system?
Right. I mean, boys' locker room just got unfolded yesterday, and today we've been talking about girls' locker room. And it is increasingly disturbing because we've probably been shying away from talking about sexuality, looking at principles of gender equality and how we inculcate those principles with the next generation. That has been one of our challenges. And I think if we were to go back and reflect even on our behaviors, because it is possible that if I am giving a gender equality lecture today, I may be doing some sort of gender discrimination against a person tomorrow. So it's a continuous and it's an evolving process, in which we have to work with us, check ourselves, our language, our attitude towards people, but also look at how can we inculcate the similar, equitable environment and principles with the next generation. Talk about body, talk about sexuality, talk about different gender relationships, and also talk about equality in all spaces, public, private, and workspaces, to see how we are not perpetuating these kind of discriminatory stereotypes and norms moving forward.
There's a hand raised. Could we take that? Dr. Pradeep Kumar Lenka.
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Sir, I have a question. Whether any media house in India is owned by women?
Sir, I wouldn't exactly know if a media house is solely owned by a woman, but I do know, for example, Fair D'Souza is either in the process or has very, very recently established her own media house, or a journalist space for herself. I'm not sure if it's solely owned by her, but that's one example that I do know of. I do also know from previous media reports that there have been attempts in the past, but I am not very familiar with either those attempts have been transacted yet or not.
Okay.
So, but
And another,
for example, did mention of an independent media house, but I am not sure how far it has progressed.
Anya, if
That
with your permission, may I intervene?
Yes, sir, please.
okay. Thank you,
See,
ma'am.
when we are talking of corporate newspapers, there are women on the board. But there are umpteen number of smaller publications which are playing a wonderful role, especially in the language media, and they are run by women. That's great. Dr. Laika, could we give others an opportunity to ask questions? The other question, Sanya, from Dr. Shobha Matthew Bennett. She wants to know why are rapes seen more in some places, whereas they are low in the other.
Right. I'm not sure if by places she means geographically or either domestic spaces and versus public spaces. But I would say that, if it's geographically or even otherwise, it's not that one state reports more than the other. It's just about how well are we reporting, because if you go by the statistics, if 1 in 3 women faced violence in their lifetime, and if one girl in 2 minutes is, is either facing sexual violence or abuse in India, and that's the stats that I'm referring to, how much of that is being reported because of the fear of retaliation, because of the fear of letting down the family honor, etc., completely depends on the society that we live in, completely depends on how empowered do I feel in going out and making this public, reporting this through various mediums and resources that are available to me. So it's not really that one place has more rape cases than the other, but how women are being empowered to report these cases, to actually take an action, or are being forced to be quiet to protect the family honor.
We'll go back to the raised hands. I think Dr. Ola Avukar's hand is still raised. Ola, we are unmuting you. Could you ask a question? Are you there online? Okay, there is a question in the chat box, but the same gentleman is also on raised hands. Santosh Gangude. He wanted to know about the situation of commercial sex workers. Should we unmute
Sure.
Gangude? Yeah. Mr. Santosh Gangude, go ahead, please. Speak. You may ask your question.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful session, ma'am. I just have a query. What is the impact of this COVID-19 on commercial sex workers and how it is reported in media? Have you come across any report in media about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I did come across one article about sex workers in the media. And definitely because of the isolation, there is loss of income, which was the traditional way for them to earn any sort of, money. So of course, there is a different kind of livelihood and work impact on them. The second is also the kind of discrimination they've been facing, because unfortunately what happens is, if there is a health crisis, it does not immediately settle very well with us. And what a health crisis does is it also attaches different stereotypes with it. So I was reading this report which came out of another particular state, which said that the commercial sex workers were also being discriminated as the carriers of coronavirus, because they have multiple sexual partners as a part of their job. So, those kind of discriminations, and then being thrown out either of the neighborhood or of their rental apartments because of the stigmatization that they are commercial sex workers and therefore carriers of coronavirus. in addition to their loss of livelihood and income, in addition to also the kind of mental torture that one goes through, because isolation is not easy for anybody, especially for those who are at the margins, as it is in the society. So those are a lot of implications that I did read a media article on.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Tanya, could we take just two more questions from the chat
Sure,
box?
sure.
There's one question from Dr. Ignacy A. The question is COVID-19 crisis and high sale of contraceptives. Do they raise any questions?
Sorry, I didn't understand that, sir.
Neither did I. The query is about COVID-19 crisis and the high sale of contraceptives.
Right.
Does that raise any questions?
I mean, that does not raise any question, but I would say that it is definitely a step in the right direction, because, with the health crisis, a lot of our budgets and finances move towards preventing and responding to people who have been affected by the virus. And in that, what we also then face is limitations in our access to sexual and reproductive rights. And just the availability of contraceptives, because one also knows that in isolation, it may get, one may face limited access to such, provisions. I think it's a good attempt where the sale has probably gone up, or it is more widely available. It shows that while we are in a health crisis, we've not forgotten our reproductive and sexual health rights. It also shows that one is increasingly becoming more conscious of our family planning, options and resources. I don't necessarily see how that is any kind of a challenge, or how that is negative, in the outplay.
Okay, Sania, we'll take the last question from the chat box. It's from
Sure.
Elena DeCosta. Do you think we should work on combating dominant hegemonic masculinity as much as we work on women issues?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Do you think we should work on combating dominant hegemonic masculinity as much as we work on women's issues?
Yes, I think that definitely goes hand in hand, because, how do you otherwise plan your interventions? And, this is something that we increasingly work on, which is, if you're talking about women's issues, if you're talking about feminist approach to the development sector, you cannot leave out working with men and boys, which is to say that you cannot leave out the patriarchal values that are still so deeply, embedded in our society and our cultural, environment. So definitely, I think both of them goes hand in hand. While you work with women, you also have to work with men, because otherwise it's not going to be substantive enough. It's not going to be transformative in its nature.
Thank you so much, Sania. I think we'll have to wind up here. Thanks for such a wonderful session and great answers also to the questions. I think we've taken almost all the questions raised. And thanks for your time. It has been very enlightening. A big thank you not only on behalf of the Nirmala Memorial Foundation College of Commerce and Science and Griffith University, also on my behalf, a personal thank you.
Thank you.
Before we wind up, for the participants, some administrative announcements. A gentle reminder about tomorrow's topic, reporting issues of children during COVID-19 pandemic. Remember to come in at 4 o'clock so that we start on time. Thanks for being here. It was wonderful to have such a wonderful audience. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.